Professor George CHRYSSIDES was emerged in the last years as a leading international scholar on Jehovah's Witnesses, and this speech is about why an opposition to Jehovah's Witnesses is being manifested at a global scale. So, Professor CHRYSSIDES.
Well, greetings from England, and I'm sorry not to be here in person. I've been given this title by the organisers, and it's one that can't readily be compressed into 20 minutes, so I can't go into very much detail or elaborate on the issues, and inevitably there will be omissions. The title tends to elicit negative comment without allowing possible responses by the Watchtower organisation. Some of these deficiencies will be remedied when I do the write-up for the Journal of Cesnur. The approach I'm taking is roughly historical, but the Society's problems don't always follow a neat chronological pattern. But I'll start at the beginning, with Charles Taze Russell, who founded Zion's Tract Society in 1881. Russell's major publication, as you probably know, was the 6-volume Studies in the Scriptures, which taught his doctrines, several of which varied from those of mainstream Christianity. And in particular, he taught, among other things, that there was no eternal hell, that Jesus Christ was a divine being but not God himself, that there shouldn't be a clergy class distinct from the laity, and that Christendom had abandoned the original teachings of Jesus and his early apostles. Well, that attracted a backlash of criticism, and you can see some of the comments here that his critics made. One of the greatest of the many false prophets, damnable heresies, not exactly quotations that you'd like to appear on the back of a book that you had written, but that's what the critics were saying. And in particular, Torrey and Dixon, who wrote the famous set of tracts that defined the principles of fundamentalism, there was an article by a clergyman called Moorhouse, and he listed, after his discussion, a rather long chain of doctrines that he thought were false. I won't go through them all, but as you'll see from the slide, most of them were directed about his views on the person of Christ. And that wasn't all, really, because here was Russell saying the whole of Christianity has got it wrong, I've got it right. And it raised the question, who was Russell? And when people reflected on who Russell was, the answer was that he was a haberdasher. He sold shirts. So I get great shirts at Boundary Mill just outside Walsall, but I wouldn't care to go along and ask them to explain the Bible to me. So you can see that there was a kind of feeling that this haberdasher, who was self-educated, hadn't really any right to be telling the whole of Christendom that really they had misunderstood their faith. Well, from doctrinal concerns, we move on to other criticisms. And one of the early grounds for criticism of Russell and the Watchtower Society was the notorious miracle wheat scandal. Actually, it wasn't really much of a scandal, but it attracted a lot of publicity. The story was, in brief, that a farmer discovered a crop of wheat that had an amazing yield, and he offered some of it to the society in order to boost its funds. He believed that the phenomenon fulfilled Ezekiel's prophecy, the earth shall yield her increase, and that this was one of the signs of the end times. Well, it was discovered that the crop was simply a mutation. It didn't continue to yield the amazing yield, but the newspaper, the Brooklyn Eagle, got hold of the story, and it commented very negatively. And in particular, it published a cartoon that you can see on screen that Russell took exception to, and he decided to sue for libel. And unfortunately he lost his case, so clearly that made matters worse. There were other problems too that the media got hold of. There was the issue about his marriage. His divorce with Maria, his wife, was fairly acrimonious, involving allegations of sexual impropriety. And then the third court case that Russell was involved in was one against the Baptist preacher J.J. Ross, who had written a pamphlet denouncing Russell and his doctrines. Again, Russell sued and lost his case. So this served to undermine public assessment of the Watchtower organization and of Russell in particular. So as we move on, Russell died in 1916. He was succeeded by Joseph Franklin Rutherford, an attorney. Rutherford sorted the publication of a book called The Finished Mystery. This was allegedly a posthumous work by Russell. That's what it says inside the front cover. In fact, it wasn't written by Russell. It was compiled by three people, Clayton Woodworth, George Fisher, and very probably a woman called Gertrude Seibert, who tends not to get mentioned, I guess, because she's a woman, and it was the man that tended to get the credit. But it was published in 1917, which was precisely the year that America entered World War II. And to make matters worse, it expressed opposition both to war and to patriotism. So Rutherford and 7 other Watchtower leaders were rounded up by the authorities. They were charged with conspiracy under the Espionage Act, which is a bit surprising, but they were imprisoned and they were released nearly 2 years later in 1919. So, despite the unpopularity that this aroused, this didn't undermine Rutherford's confidence in his ideas. At a rally just 3 years later, at a convention at Cedar Point in Ohio, in one of his speeches, the climax of it was advertise, advertise, advertise the king and his kingdom. So Rutherford wasn't going to be put off. His followers were, notwithstanding, going to advertise the king and the kingdom, which involved, among other things, the house-to-house evangelism, for which the society is still well known. Advertising the kingdom didn't just involve house to house. It involved what were called information marches. And funnily enough, the April 2020 edition of the Watchtower has got a picture of these on its front cover. These were processions of supporters who generally wore sandwich boards. Sometimes they used them to advertise the society's events, but often they were simply expressing their ideas, often bearing the slogan, "Religion is a snare and a racket." Religion meaning mainstream Christianity. One such information march advertised a lecture to be given by Rutherford in the Royal Albert Hall in London, and it was entitled "Face the Facts." And this lecture was broadcast to 150,000 listeners in various countries, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and of course the UK. And in that lecture, Rutherford claimed to affirm 2, as he called them, undisputed facts. The first undisputed fact was that Christ had come to establish God's kingdom. The second was less indisputable. Rutherford spoke of what he called a hideous monstrosity that had arisen in earthly governments, particularly Italy and Germany, and with which he claimed the Christian churches had colluded. And as the speech went on, what he said was much stronger. He talked about the audience going to die You have yielded willingly to Satan, abandoned God and his king. You have permitted the devil to gather you to Armageddon. Christ Jesus, leading his invincible army, will slay you and give your dead carcasses to the fowls of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth. Well, that's strong stuff. In fact, it proved too strong for 3 of the radio stations, who at that point cut off the broadcast halfway through. Well, related to the patriotism issue was another one that aroused considerable controversy, the flag salute controversy. In 1935, Rutherford spoke at a convention in which he opposed patriotism, and in particular, he urged members to refuse to salute the national flag. And some witness children took that to heart, and when they went back to school, they decided to refuse the flag salute. And as a result, they were expelled from their schools. So the most famous of the cases involved 2 school children called Lillian and William Vytautas, and their family challenged their exclusion in court back in 1937. That aroused a number of court cases and appeals. Eventually, in 1943, the Supreme Court conferred the right of refusal. So the witnesses won, but they didn't win any public popularity as a result. And again, this fueled some of the hostility that was directed against the organisation. 2 other things are worth mentioning relating to Rutherford's period of office. It was Rutherford who was responsible for abandoning the celebration of Christmas. The last Christmas to be celebrated by the Society was in 1926 at the Brooklyn Bethel. The Society has never celebrated Easter, Saints' Days or Halloween, and sometime after Rutherford's death, the celebration of birthdays was added to the list of festivals to be avoided. And as is fairly commonly known, the only festival that Jehovah's Witnesses celebrate is the annual memorial of Christ's death on the 14th day of the Jewish month Nisan. So the non-celebration of festivals, again, is something that arouses public criticism. The other thing that is relevant to Rutherford's period, and indeed later, is a common criticism that is levelled against Jehovah's Witnesses' failed prophecy. It's been a constant criticism, but particular note should be made of the year 1925. Rutherford had proclaimed that the ancient worthies would return in that year. The ancient worthies being the patriarchs and the principal characters of the Hebrew scriptures, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, King David, and many others were going to return. Rutherford, in fact, had a special house built for them. It's still there. I visited it at Beth Sarim, it's called, outside San Diego. And the 1925 prophecy didn't materialize. Rutherford was forced to admit publicly that he was simply wrong. Somewhat later, the year 1975 yielded similar failed expectations, although it was less explicitly stated in the Society's literature. It was mentioned, particularly by Frederick Franz, at talks at conventions, and there was a public expectation that caused many witnesses to give up jobs, to sell their possessions, to abandon intentions of having children, so that they could prepare themselves and other people for the coming Armageddon that they expected. Again, 1975 came and went. There was a bit of leeway in the calculations, but by the end of 1976, people began to realize that the end wasn't happening, human affairs were continuing, and that, again, the Society had got it wrong. The subject of failed prophecy is one I've addressed at length elsewhere. I think a lot of the criticisms of the organisation are simply unfair and don't understand their chronology, but that's another story I can't go into now. The other subject, of course, that arouses a lot of criticism is the Society's stance on blood. And we need to mention that. Rutherford died in 1942, and it was under his successor, Nathan H. Knorr, that the issue gained momentum. The first Watchtower article to mention the issue with disapproval, stating that it was contrary to God's law, appeared in 1944, and subsequent Watchtower publications went on to discuss the issue further. But finally, in 1961, it was declared that accepting blood transfusion knowingly and voluntarily was grounds for disfellowshipping. The public perception of the organisation, I have to say, wasn't enhanced by a 1994 article in Awake, which featured 4 youths. 2 of them were aged 17 and 2 were only aged 12, and they're mentioned with approval in the article as youths who were prepared to die rather than to accept blood. And again, many people thought that that shouldn't be the case. Well, I mentioned disfellowshipping in what I said there. In Russell's time, there was provision for excluding offending members, but what he said was that one should simply avoid disreputable company, but if it was appropriate, the congregation themselves could decide whether someone ought no longer to belong. But Knorr used biblical support to promote a rather stricter line. Serious offences were matters that merited congregational discipline, which should be dealt with by judicial committees of elders who would consider offences. And this was in line with Jesus' teaching that first of all one mentioned wrongdoing to the person who was committing it, then one should go to the congregation, and after that then it was a matter of formal discipline. There are 3 types of sanction in the Watchtower organisation. There is what is called marking, where a particular member who is not towing the line is given special scrutiny by the elders, placed, if you like, under surveillance. Well, not literally, but an eye is kept on that person. A judicial committee can issue a reproof, which can either be private or public, and then the final sanction is disfellowshipping. Disfellowshipping, incidentally, isn't permanent. There is opportunity to satisfy the elders that you've suitably repented and be brought back in. But while one is disfellowshipped, this involves another practice that often incurs criticism, the practice of shunning. The disfellowship member can attend meetings, but he may not or she may not be spoken to or even greeted by other members. And these criticisms have been taken up in the media, and in fact a number of feature films have been made. All of these involve at least one of these practices that I've mentioned: blood, disfellowshipping and shunning. In fact, some of them mention all 3 and address these as issues which there is a story behind, sometimes based on fact, sometimes pure fiction. Well, another problem that has offended particularly the Christian evangelicals is the Watchtowers Translation of the Bible, the New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures. The first part of this translation appeared in 1950, and the project was completed in 1961. The translation inevitably attracted criticism, not only because of its rendering of controversial passages, but a number of evangelical Christians drew attention to the work of a person by the name of Johannes Graeber. Actually, he's not very significant, but a lot of the Christian evangelicals think he is. They have alleged that Graeber, who was a Roman Catholic priest who turned spiritualist, it was alleged that particularly his wife was instrumental in obtaining guidance from the spirit world in influencing Graeber's own translation of the Bible. And Graeber's translation is quoted occasionally, not very often, very occasionally, in Watchtower literature. One of these, the word "Who is he according to John," mentions Graeber and quotes his translation. But the countercult critics won't let go of this. They continue to mention Graeber. They've got long memories as well as attention to detail. One particular verse in the New World Translation continues to be severely criticized. It's John chapter 1 verse 1, where the rendering of ton theos in hologos, it's rendered as "the word was our God." I guess that's a possible translation, but mainstream Christians have taken exception to it because it appears to downgrade the person of Jesus Christ, and it's generated a lot of criticism. Those writers whose names appear on the slide are among a number who have taken the Watchtower Society to task on that one. Well, much more serious opposition is political opposition, because that actually prevents the Society from doing its work. And I guess the most serious problems the Society has faced were in Nazi Germany, South Korea and in Russia, and in more recent times one ought to add China to the list, but they're not the only ones. Since 1953 in South Korea, young men, some 19,000 in all, have received prison sentences for refusing military service. The situation has improved a bit in recent years, but the same can't be said of Russia, where Jehovah's Witnesses' fortunes have been changing. After perestroika, there appeared to be grounds for optimism, but in 2002, the Russian federal authorities passed a law entitled "On Combating Extremist Activity," and for various reasons, the Society was judged to be an extremist group. And hostility was orchestrated by Alexander Dvorkin. He established Russia's first anti-cult organization back in 1993, and he advises the Russian government in a very negative way about Jehovah's Witnesses. So in 2017, the Russian Supreme Court required the liquidation of all the Society's assets, making it impossible for their premises to be used for meetings. According to my most recent information, 44 witnesses have been imprisoned, 29 are under house arrest, and there have been well over 1,000 home raids. So quite a serious situation in Russia, which continues. I need to mention two further sources of criticism. In the wake of recent concern about sexual abuse, which has not only involved the witnesses, one should emphasize, it's perhaps inevitable that the spotlight should turn onto the Watchtower Society. There's certainly no doubt that sexual abuse has occurred within the organization. In fact, I was an expert witness a short time ago in a case where the ministerial servant involved had admitted that he had sexually abused a young girl on repeated occasions. It does happen in the Society. It also happens in the Church of England, the Roman Catholic Church, in various secular organizations. But there are certainly fewer opportunities in an organisation like the Watchtower Society where there aren't special activities for children. It would actually be very difficult to be alone with a child in a Kingdom Hall. But Jehovah's Witnesses tend to have been specifically targeted, and in particular the Australian and the Netherlands governments have published official reports, Australia in 2016 and the Netherlands in 2019, with recommendations for changes in the Society's policies. So I'm sorry I don't have time to go into detail on that. It could merit a lot of discussion. But one final line of opposition I want to mention is online opposition. And with the rise in the internet, then the internet has afforded an ideal forum for publicising hostility to the Watchtower Society. It enables critiques of its doctrinal and social issues. You don't have to go far on the internet to find criticisms of blood, of disfellowshipping, shunning, and indeed child sexual abuse. Perhaps one slightly positive function should be noted, however. The role of social media does help people that have left the society and find that they've lost their community and maybe their family as well, to find a new community who not only meet online, but some of them do meet up physically on occasions and can share experiences, but not just experiences, they can actually share social activities as well. So it's not all bad. But inevitably, the old accusations get revived. You can still very easily find the miracle wheat scandal being brought to attention, the failed prophecies, not just 1925 and 1975. Quite a lot of the dates are actually just invented. I can't find any basis for them. And Graeber, among others, is still alive and well. So what I've done is to outline the grounds for criticism of the Watchtower Society, and I know that's been negative. I'll say a lot more about them in the write-up of the article, where there's much more opportunity for discussion. In the conference that follows today, I'm sure there will be opportunity to discuss these criticisms, and I hope that this at least sets the scenes. I haven't been able to discuss the extent to which these criticisms are justified. I haven't been able to say how the society has responded. These await further discussion. The society does acknowledge that it's made past mistakes. Well, haven't we all? But it continues to believe that the truth shouldn't be compromised by secular ideologies or by vociferous critics. As Jesus said, "You will be hated by all people on account of my name, but the one who has endured to the end will be saved." And the Watchtower Society has endured, and they believe that the end is indeed near. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to the ensuing discussion.